I was actually sitting in a coffee shop the other day, just eavesdropping, as you do.
Yeah, always dangerous.
Right. But I heard this conversation that I think perfectly captures the zeitgeist right now. It was two guys talking about their kids' homework, and one of them just threw his hands up and said, "Why are they still drilling state capitals? Why are they learning long division? I mean, my phone can do all of that in a microsecond."
Yeah, that is the prevailing sentiment of the decade. It's that outsourcing argument.
Exactly. And honestly, it is incredibly tempting. It's really tempting to look at human memory as this dusty, low-capacity hard drive that we just don't need anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, the cloud is infinite. If ChatGPT has read every book and scanned every article, why do I need to hold on to anything? Why carry the weight of knowledge if I can just rent it?
It feels efficient, right? It feels like progress. But if
Yeah.
you actually pull on that thread, the sweater unravels pretty quickly. And that is exactly where we are going today.
We are jumping back into our series on Designing Futures by Jafar Humayun. And for anyone just joining us for this deep dive, let's do a quick level set because this isn't your typical tech commentary.
No, it's definitely not.
Designing Futures is not a solutions manual. It's not a list of 10 ways to get rich with AI. It's a narrowing of the field. This series explores which futures remain structurally viable once trade-offs, incentives, and limits are taken seriously.
Right. Jafar is really looking at the architecture of the next decade and saying, let's stop dreaming for a second and look at cognitive physics.
And today, we're doing a deep dive specifically into episode 2 of his work. The title is Why the AI Age Needs Both Rote Learning and Critical Thinking. And I have to say, that title alone is enough to start a riot in a teacher's lounge.
It is provocative. The term rote learning has a terrible brand.
It really does. It sounds like a 19th century schoolhouse. Rulers on knuckles, drilling facts until your eyes glaze over.
It feels like regression. But Jafar argues that this isn't about nostalgia. This is an investigation into cognitive bandwidth. The argument he makes is counterintuitive, but when you analyze the mechanics of thought, it's unavoidable. In a world of infinite external information, your internal models matter more, not less.
So let's unpack that logic. Because the standard pitch for AI, the one we hear in every marketing deck, is the exact opposite. The pitch is the AI handles the boring stuff so we humans are free to do the big thinking. Why does Jafar think that's a structural risk?
Well, first we have to accept the reality check he provides. We have to admit that machine intelligence has completely commoditized certain human functions. Retrieval. The machine wins. Pattern matching and procedural execution. The machine is faster and more consistent.
If you're competing with an AI on who can write a standard cover letter fastest, you lose.
You lose instantly. But the point here is that this commoditization doesn't make humans obsolete. It pushes human value upward. If the machine handles the base layer of information, the human role shifts to new domains of value, things like cross-domain synthesis, ethical and contextual judgment, and this is the big one, error detection.
Error detection, knowing when the bot is hallucinating.
Exactly. Or knowing when the output is technically correct but contextually a disaster. Jafar frames these not as soft skills, but as the differentiating mechanisms of human relevance. They are valuable because they depend on lived context and human responsibility.
Right, because an AI doesn't have skin in the game.
Precisely. It cannot own the consequences of a bad decision.
So, if I can summarize the shift, we stop being the encyclopedia because the encyclopedia is now free and we start being the editor.
I'd go a step further. We become the architect. But, and this is the huge caveat in this deep dive, you cannot be an architect if you don't understand the properties of the materials you're building with. You can't just point at a pile of bricks and say, build a house if you don't fundamentally understand load-bearing walls.
And this brings us to the core controversy of this piece, because Jafar argues that if we abandon what he calls an internalized substrate, if we stop forcing ourselves to build mental models, we aren't liberating our minds for higher thought. We're actually creating massive cognitive friction.
Yes. He views this internalized knowledge as cognitive fuel. And to understand why, we have to look at the physics of how thinking actually works. We need to talk about working memory constraints.
Okay, break the mechanics down for us. Why does having an internal model matter if I can just look the facts up in 2 seconds?
Think of your conscious mind like a workbench. But it's a very small workbench. You can only hold a few items on it at once. Cognitive psychologists usually say it's about 3 or 4 distinct chunks of information. Now, if you are trying to solve a complex problem, say analyzing a geopolitical conflict, You need to pull items onto that workbench to manipulate them.
Okay, I'm visualizing it. I've got the conflict, the players, the history on the bench.
Here is the catch. If you have built an internalized substrate of the history, the geography, and the key players, those things are stored in your long-term memory. You can summon them to the workbench instantly as a single compressed unit. It takes up almost no space on the bench.
Right, it's like a zip file. I unzip it and it's there. I don't have to assemble it from scratch.
Exactly. That is mental compression. But if you haven't internalized that knowledge, if you have to look up where the country is on a map and then look up who the prime minister is and then look up the last 3 wars they fought, your workbench is full of clutter. You are spending all your cognitive bandwidth just fetching the data.
You have zero bandwidth left to actually analyze it.
Precisely. It's the difference between speaking a language fluently and trying to have a conversation while looking up every third word in a dictionary. You just don't have the processing power left over for the synthesis because you're drowning in the mechanics.
That makes total sense. You can't be creative if you're stuck on the basics.
Yeah.
And Jafar gives some really stark examples of this structural dependency in the text. History was one that really stood out to me.
The history example is vital. He argues you cannot critique a historical narrative if you don't have an internal timeline to hang the facts on. If you hear about a conflict in the Balkans and you have no mental model of the Ottoman Empire or the 1990s, you can't assess the information. You're just seeing isolated data points.
You can't see the flow of cause and effect. And statistics was another one. In an age of synthetic media, this feels like a huge strategic mismatch if we get it wrong.
It absolutely is. If you don't have an internal grasp of probability, if you haven't internalized what a normal distribution looks like or what per capita actually implies versus absolute numbers, you cannot detect statistical manipulation.
Because if an AI throws a perfectly formatted chart at you, you have no internal defense system.
Right. You just have to accept it because you don't have the mental tools to dismantle it on the fly. And the same goes for evaluating an AI recommendation in business or medicine. You cannot evaluate a machine suggestion if you don't have internalized domain knowledge.
And that leads to a really concerning point he makes. He says that without this deep reservoir of internalized knowledge, critical thinking collapses. It stops being analysis and just becomes opinions.
Or vibes.
Or prompt following, that's the key phrase. Jafar is emphasizing that this is about structural dependency. If you don't know the basics, you aren't thinking critically, you are just trusting the output of the machine. So we've established the problem. You can't think critically in a vacuum. You need an internal substrate to think with. This leads us to the central metaphor of episode 2, which I found incredibly helpful for visualizing how these pieces fit together. The fuel, the engine, and the turbocharger.
It's a brilliant way to map the symbiosis. It shows how sequential and structural this relationship is. So let's look at the model. Rote learning, or building that internal substrate, is the fuel. It's the raw material you've stored in your brain.
Okay, so that's the gas in the tank.
Right. Then critical thinking is the engine. It's the mechanism that burns the fuel to get you somewhere. It operates on that substrate to provide direction and judgment.
And the AI.
The AI is the turbocharger. A turbocharger forces more air into the engine to create a massive boost in power. But a turbocharger does nothing if the engine is off. And the engine won't run if there's no fuel.
So if we try to just use AI without having any internalized mental models, we basically just have a turbocharger bolted onto a block of wood.
Effectively, yes. And Jafar breaks down the failure modes here, and they are really instructive. If you have the internalized substrate without critical thinking, what do you get?
That's the functional obsolescence piece.
Exactly. You're just a walking encyclopedia in a world of infinite search. You are competing with a database, and you will lose.
But the other failure mode is the one we are risking right now. Critical thinking without the internalized substrate.
Right. That creates what he calls hollow opinions. You have the engine, you want to question, you want to analyze, but you have no fuel to burn.
So you end up just arguing based on how things feel, or you end up just repeating what the AI told you because it sounds plausible and confident.
Precisely. Removing internalized knowledge converts thinking into prompt following. We have to shift from asking the machine, what is the answer, to determining, is this answer biased? Is it incomplete? Is it dangerous?
And you cannot answer those questions if you have to ask the AI to evaluate its own answers for you.
Exactly. It's a closed loop of dependency.
This really shifts the goalposts for how we design education and training, doesn't it? It's not about learning less because the machine knows more. It's about structuring your learning sequence differently. Jafar calls this the full-stack human model. What does a full-stack human look like in practice?
It's a very deliberate design sequence. Phase one is what he calls compressed foundations. The goal here is automaticity. You need to master the fundamentals of your field, whether that's math, language, or logic, to the point where recall requires zero conscious effort.
Zero conscious effort means I'm not actively thinking about the rule, I'm just using it.
Exactly. It's like reading. When you look at a sentence, you don't sound out the letters anymore. You see the word and you know the meaning instantly. That is automaticity. Jafar argues we need this efficiency to free up the brain for phase two, which is applied critical thinking.
Which is where the actual value lives now.
Right. Once the basics are automatic, your brain is free to focus on problem framing, error detection, and ethical reasoning. You use your internal knowledge to reason, challenge, and create. And then you apply the turbocharger. You use AI to amplify your output.
But the sequence is non-negotiable. The AI amplifies the output of the person who already possesses an internal engine of understanding.
That is the crucial distinction. If you use AI to bypass the foundational learning process, you remain dependent forever. If you use it to accelerate your workflow after you've achieved automaticity, you gain incredible leverage.
It frames AI not as a shortcut that replaces human learning, but as a multiplier. And like you said, you can't multiply zero.
Exactly. And this brings us to the final, and honestly the most profound part of the source material, the structural risk to society. Because if we get this wrong, if we decide as a culture that people don't need to build these mental models anymore, we don't just get a slight dip in productivity, we get a massive structural divide.
Jafar calls this the risk of cognitive stratification.
Yes. If we abandon building that internal substrate, we don't get equality. We get a split between two very different types of people.
Paint the picture for us. What do these two groups look like in this viable future?
Group A are the people with deep internal models. They've done the work, they have the context, they understand the mechanics of their field. They use AI for massive leverage, they direct the machine.
They're the ones exerting control.
Right. They can say, draft this, but change the logic here because I know this framework is flawed. They are in charge because they can judge the output. They have the internal authority to steer.
And Group B?
Group B are the people with surface-level skills who exist in total dependency on the AI. They can prompt, but they cannot judge. If the AI hallucinates, they believe it. If the AI is biased, they adopt the bias.
That is a deeply unsettling thought. A whole class of people who can prompt but not judge.
And Jafar analyzes this as a move away from progress and toward a rigid social decoupling. It locks people out of true agency. If you can't verify the truth for yourself, you are at the mercy of whatever system feeds you the information.
It's interesting because usually when we talk about inequality in tech, we talk about who has access to the hardware or the software. But this framework suggests the real inequality will be about who has the internal cognitive software to use the tools effectively.
That's the cognitive friction involved. The people with deep mental models remove that friction through automaticity, while the dependent group is constantly buffering, waiting for the machine to tell them what is true.
So, bringing this all back to the mission of designing futures, the goal isn't to reject AI, and it's not to advocate for blind drilling of facts just for the sake of it. It's about recognizing the requirements of cognitive physics.
Right. It's about recognizing that the AI age demands better sequencing. We need to build the fuel, the internalized substrate, so we can run the engine of critical thinking. And then, and only then, hit the turbocharger.
It really changes how you look at your own learning stack. It moves you from asking, why do I need to learn this, to asking, how does internalizing this give me the power to steer the machine?
Exactly. It's about agency. The goal of this analysis is to identify the structural path that keeps humans in the driver's seat. And this episode makes a compelling case that the driver's seat requires a driver who knows the rules of the road by heart.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with the final provocative thought directly from Jafar Humayun's text. It's a question that I think everyone needs to sit with, whether you're designing a curriculum, running a company, or just navigating this new landscape.
The question is this. If we externalize all of our knowledge to the machine, do we still have enough of a mental model left to recognize when the machine is wrong?
If you can't answer yes to that with total confidence, it might be time to start rebuilding those compressed foundations.
Absolutely.
That is it for this deep dive. But don't go too far, because in the next installment of our series on designing futures, we're going to look at something equally fascinating. The title of the next piece is How We Reverse the Logic of Discovery and Invention.
It's a brilliant look at how AI doesn't just change what we discover, but the fundamental sequence of how discovery happens.
I cannot wait to get into that one. Stay tuned, stay curious, stay systemic.